Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Is there anyone who's more proficient than me at reading the Sanskrit? There's one text anyway. I'll struggle along. First I'm going to read text 10, and I think it's text 11 on the board, right? Huh? What is here on the board? Underlined is 11. What is the word that it starts with? Tam eva paramatmanam. Huh? Okay. Dusaha preshta viraha tivra tapa tutushaba dhyana praptat tuta shlesha nirvritya shinamangala. That's text number 10. They're combined, so the translation is combined. So I'm just to save time, because I've got a lot of ground to cover if I'm going to discuss the things that I want to discuss. So to save some time, I'm going to skip the word for word synonyms. We'll read this responsibly a little bit, and then we'll go right into the translation, if you don't mind, with your permission. So, tam eva paramatmanam jara buddhyapi sangata jahur gunamayam deham sadya prakshina bandhanaha. Tam eva paramatmanam jara buddhyapi sangata jahur gunamayam deham sadya prakshina bandhanaha. Okay. For those gopis who could not go to see Krishna, intolerable separation from their beloved caused an intense agony that burned away all impious karma. By meditating upon him, they realized his embrace, and the ecstasy they then felt exhausted their material piety. Although Lord Krishna is the Supreme Soul, these girls simply thought of him as their male lover and associated with him in that intimate mood. Thus their karmic bondage was nullified, and they abandoned their gross material bodies. We can repeat this, please. For those gopis who could not go to see Krishna, intolerable separation from their beloved caused an intense agony that burned away all impious karma. By meditating upon him, they realized his embrace, and the ecstasy they felt exhausted their material piety. Although Lord Krishna is the Supreme Soul, these girls simply thought of him as their male lover and associated with him in that intimate mood. Thus their karmic bondage was nullified, and they abandoned their gross material bodies. So, this is a very long purport, and it's a very beautiful purport. Mainly, it's actually completely. This purport is Vishwanath's commentaries. It's about 5 pages. So please listen attentively. Usually, I guess fortunately or unfortunately, I have a tendency to overextend the class time. It is mentioned that the Rasa Dance was extended to the length of a night of Brahma. Sometimes I wish the class time could be at least extended to the length of a moment of Brahma. So that we could have enough time to at least make a humble attempt to glorify the principles and ideals which are established by this most elevated subject matter in this section of the Bhagavatam. Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti comments upon this verse as follows. Here Shukadeva Goswami speaks in a peculiar way. Listen attentively, please. He presents the intimate object the gopis attained as if it were an external idea, thus keeping its true nature secret from outsiders. So we might ask the question, are we insiders or outsiders? While at the same time, he reveals to the confidential devotees, well versed in the scientific conclusions of devotional service, the internal meaning that is his real purport. Thus, to outsiders, Shukadeva Goswami says that Krishna gave the gopis liberation. So the outsiders are those who are liberationists, obviously. In other words, they're not in tune with the real meaning of bhakti. Some people are bhukti kami and some people are mukti kami. But to the confidential hearers, Shukadev reveals that when the gopis experienced separation from their beloved, there arose in them immeasurable unhappiness and immeasurable happiness, and that they gradually achieved their desired goal. Thus, the verse can be understood as follows. Because of their intolerable separation from their beloved, the gopis felt terrible agony by which they caused all inauspicious things to tremble. In other words, when people in general hear of the gopis' extreme agony and separation from their beloved, they abandon thousands of inauspicious things. This is very interesting to note. I'm not going to comment on it now, but there's some very interesting points, and we should mark them as we go along. People in general, when they hear of the gopis' extreme agony and separation from their beloved, they abandon thousands of inauspicious things simply by hearing about these pastimes of Krishna and the gopis, and how Krishna again and again puts them in agony, which is the nature of Krishna for his own purposes, which is always for the benefit of his devotees. Things even as fearsome as the subterranean fires of millions of universes or the powerful poison swallowed by Lord Shiva, all these things were abandoned, are abandoned by people in general who hear of these topics. More specifically, those who hear of the gopis' love and separation give up their terrible false ego, and thinking themselves defeated, are shaken. So, first he's talking about the hearing about this extreme agony in separation, and that causes people in general to give up all inauspicious things. And then upon hearing about the gopis' intensified love for Krishna and separation, that causes people in general to give up their terrible false egos, and we could say also false pride and false prestige. Thinking themselves defeated, they are shaken. When the gopis meditated on Lord Achyuta, he became manifest and personally came to them. And they experienced great joy by embracing his body. This is in meditation, which was full of transcendental love for them. The gopis also experienced great joy by exhibiting personal characteristics and a sense of identification appropriate to such love. So this is an important point also, that they experience great joy by exhibiting personal characteristics. These personal characteristics will be seen in terms of their Sarup Siddhi. In other words, as it's discussed later in the purport, how it is that the transcendental body became manifest as their devotion increased and their materiality of their bodies decreased simultaneously. And it's given, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but you will see that it's shown how devotees like Dhruva, for example, went back to home, back to Godhead in his self-same body. But we should understand that for expression of the Madhurya Ras, there is need for having the Sarup, which is appropriate. So anyway, we'll get into that a little further, but just with reference to this statement that they experience great joy by exhibiting personal characteristics and a sense of identification appropriate to such love. So appropriate means that because they're Madhurya Bhaktas, they require the Madhurya Sarup to give that appropriate expression. That joy made all their good fortune, both material and spiritual, seem paltry by comparison. The implication is that when other persons see how happy the gopis became upon embracing Krishna, when he manifested himself directly before them, these other persons feel that thousands of so-called auspicious objects are insignificant by comparison, including all the sense gratificatory pleasures found in millions of universes, and even the supersensory pleasure of spiritual bliss, Brahmananda. Thus, hearing of the gopis' distress and the joy that arose, respectively, out of their separation from the Supreme Lord and their union with Him, anyone can get rid of all the reactions of his past activities, both sinful and pious. Vaishnavas certainly do not think that sinful and pious reactions can be destroyed only by being lived out, since after all, neither separation from the Supreme Lord nor direct association with Him are in the category of karma. This kind of elimination of karmic reactions occurs in the stage of bhajan for those who have come to the level of anarthana vritti. So one point can be brought out here, that there's those who have come to the level of anarthana vritti and those who are continuously in the process of anarthana vritti. Because I'll get into this a little bit later if we have time, that there is a distinction between the categorical stage of anarthana vritti and the process of anarthana vritti. And thus the gopis thought of Krishna
the Paramatma, or Supreme, worthy object of all love, as their paramour. Even though such a concept is ordinarily contemptible, the Gopis realize Krishna in an even fuller sense than did Rukmini and his other queens, who thought of him most respectfully as their husband. So now we're getting into the distinction between the Parakya Ras and Swakya Ras. That thinking of the Lord as one's paramour is superior to thinking of him as one's husband is proved by the fact that unbridled pure love is superior to domesticated love. This idea is borne out by the following words of Sri Uddhava: Yad dushjajam swajanam arya patam chahitva. These ladies of Braja abandon their families and their advanced religious principles, even though to do so is very difficult. Bhagavatam 10:47-61. In his pastimes on earth, Krishna often turns the most lowly things into the most elevated. As Bhishma stated, Krishna's pastimes of acting as Arjuna's chariot driver was even more elevated than his pastimes in which he acted as a mighty king of kings. I concentrate upon the chariot driver of Arjuna, who stood with whip in his right hand and a bridle rope in his left, and who was very careful to protect Arjuna's chariot by all means. This is the quote from Bhishma. Bhagavatam 1:9-39. Similarly, in the Lord's appearance as Krishna, we see that the normally inferior conjugal rasa, namely Parakya Rasa, normally means, when we say normally inferior, he's referring to the reflection of the tree, or the perverted rasas of this material world. In the spiritual world, the tree, the topmost thing, is on the topmost branches of the tree. That is described in Srila Prabhupada's Krishna book, how the topmost thing in the spiritual world becomes reflected as the bottommost or the most abominable thing in this material world, because of its being the diametric opposite of the original Seva Bhavana of the soul. Similarly, in the Lord's appearance as Krishna, we see that normally inferior conjugal ras becomes better than the normally superior mood of Shantaras, as also the attitude of loving a paramour becomes superior to the loving exchange between legitimate spouses, and lowly gunja necklaces, red oxide paste, and peacock feathers become better than the most excellent jeweled ornaments. But it may be objected, so he's saying that although Krishna can transform, or rather the original feature of Krishna is the supermost, as opposed to the perverted reflection in the material world, still it may be objected that the gopis were not fit to be enjoyed by Krishna, because they were connected with other men, namely their so-called husbands of the material world. It may be objected that it is not fitting for the Supreme Lord to sport with women who have already been enjoyed by other men. So now Vishwanath is going to go into an elaborate discussion about how those gopis who had actually attained Krishna in Maharas, that their bodies were not enjoyed by other men because their bodies were the spiritual bodies. Krishna danced with the Siddhadeha of the living entity. He didn't dance with the Mayak form of or the material body of a gopi. And it describes how there is a gradual elevation from the material to the spiritual platform by which this becomes possible. Krishna is enjoying with the spiritual forms, and so therefore there's no question of his enjoying any material form. This objection is replied to by the words beginning with Jahu. The word deham is used here in a singular form to indicate unity of category, even though the gopis are many. Some authorities say that by the power of Yogamaya, these gopis' bodies disappeared in a way no one noticed. It means material bodies. But other authorities say that the body, in quotes, referred to in this context is the inferior body composed of the modes of material nature. Thus, by the prominence of the adjective gunamayam, it is understood that before the gopis heard the sound of Krishna's flute, their bodies had been twofold, material and spiritual. And upon hearing the flute, they gave up the material bodies which their husbands had enjoyed. This is referring to the less advanced gopis who had not yet attained the perfection of Vastu Siddhi, whereby they were able to proceed directly upon hearing the flute to Rasmandal. We're talking about the gopis who were detained by their husbands. Hare Krishna. We may analyze, this as follows. When devotees begin prosecuting devotional service in accordance with the instructions of a bona fide spiritual master, now please see how the important thing that I really want to discuss is the appropriateness of the subject matter under discussion with our own cultivation of pure devotional service and our own spiritual lives. Many times we have a tendency to see the subject matter as topics of interest, but without actual application in our own personal life. The tendency is to scrutinize some interesting specimen, practically as an armchair philosopher, or to intellectualize, or to entertain ourselves by let's say, hearing about the topics of Krishna and the gopis, etc., but without understanding the actual purpose in the discussions being presented in the pages of Bhagavatam, which are meant for our not only our edification, but our purification and our elevation to the transcendental position. When devotees begin prosecuting devotional service in accordance with the instructions of a bona fide spiritual master, they engage their ears and other senses in pure devotion by hearing of the Lord, chanting His glories, remembering Him, offering obeisances to Him, giving Him personal attendance, and so forth. Thus the devotees make the Lord's transcendental qualities the objects of their senses, as stated by the Lord Himself, Nirgunu Mad Apashraya, Bhagavatam 11:25-26. Jai Shri Nitai Gaur Radhe Shyam, Shri Krishna Balaram Ki Jai. In this way, the devotees' bodies transcend the material modes because of their transcendental engagement with Krishna or Krishnized sense objects. Yet sometimes, bringing your attention back to this point of personal application, yet sometimes the devotees may take as their sense objects mundane sounds. Where's Chakrina? And so on. And that is material. Thus, a devotee's body can have two aspects, transcendental and material. According to one's level of devotional service, to that degree, the transcendental aspects of one's body become prominent and the material aspects diminish. This transformation is described in the following verse from the Srimad Bhagavatam. And I'm going to skip the Sanskrit because I don't read very well anyway, and to save time. Devotion, direct experience of the Supreme Lord, and detachment from other things, these three occur simultaneously for one who has taken shelter of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, in the same way that pleasure, nourishment, and relief from hunger come simultaneously and increasingly with each bite for a person engaged in eating. That's the end of the quote. When one achieves totally pure love of God, the material portions of the body disappear and the body becomes completely spiritual. Nonetheless, so as not to disturb the false opinions of atheists and so as to protect the confidentiality of devotional service, the Supreme Lord usually has his illusory energy exhibit the demise of the gross body. An example of this is the disappearance of the Yadavas during the Mausa Leela, when they killed each other with the canes. Sometimes, however, to proclaim the excellence of Bhakti Yoga, Krishna will allow a devotee to go back to Godhead in his self-same body, as is in the case of Dhruva Maharaj. We can cite evidence for this point from the 25th chapter of the 11th canto. Quote, "A living entity who conquers the modes of material nature, which are manifested from the mind, can dedicate himself to me, Krishna, by the process of devotional service and thus attain pure love for me." Here, the Lord states that the defeat and destruction of that which is composed of the modes of material nature can be brought about only by the process of devotional service. Therefore, what we should understand from the present verse of the Bhagavatam is that the gopis who could not go to see Krishna had their inauspicious material bodies removed or burnt up, while their auspicious spiritual bodies, far from being destroyed, simply grew more prominent because of the ecstasy the gopis felt by embracing Krishna in meditation. Thus their bondage was completely destroyed. By the help of Yogamaya, they got free from ignorance and also from the prohibitions of their husbands and other relatives. We should not make the mistake of explaining this falling away of the gopis' bodies as being a result of their dying. As the Lord himself says, Bhagavatam 10:37, quote, "Some of those all auspicious gopis could not directly join me in enjoying the Rasa Dance on that night in this Vrindavan forest, yet still they achieved my association by remembering my transcendental pastimes. By using the word kalyanya in this verse, the Lord implies, even though these gopis wanted to give up their bodies because of their husbands' prohibitions and the torment of separation from me, for them to die at the very beginning of the most auspicious festival of the Rasa Dance would have been displeasing to me and thus inauspicious, so they did not die." That's kind of like Radharani wanting to die, but the hope of Krishna returning, to Braja after he had supposedly gone to Mathura. So she's keeping the life airs within her transcendental body on account of her knowledge of Krishna's displeasure if he were to come back to Braja and understand that she had left her body. So therefore, with the hopes of pleasing him upon his soon expected, reappearance in Braja, she continued to maintain her life airs within the body in spite of the fact that it was a torturous situation for her. More evidence that the gopis who were prevented from going to see Krishna did not physically die is proved by a statement of Sri Shukadev later in this canto, 10:47:38. Quote, "Then they, the gopis, replied to Uddhava, feeling satisfied because his message had reminded them of Krishna." End of quote. Here we understand that the gopis speaking to Uddhava were the ones who had not had the chance to participate directly in the Rasa Dance because of being held captive in their homes. Thus, the conclusion is that they gave up their material bodies without dying. Parched by the intense heat of separation, their material bodies gave up their materiality and became purely spiritual, just like the bodies... What's going on with the amp? Just like the bodies of such great devotees as Dhruva Maharaj. So he's comparing the appearance of the spiritual bodies, or the spirituality of the bodies of the gopis, as being the same as Dhruva Maharaj's body becoming completely spiritualized by complete absorption, or jagya. Brahmarpanam, Brahmahavir, Brahmagno, Brahmanahutam. Everything becomes absolutely spiritual, or Brahman, by completely absorption in the absolute. This is the meaning of the gopis giving up their bodies. The following analogy illustrates the status of the various gopis. Now this is very nice. This is interesting here. By observing 7 or 8 ripe mangoes on a tree, we can ascertain that all the fruits on the tree are ripe. Then, when we pick them all and bring them home, where in due course the sun's rays and other agents will make them fine-looking, fragrant, and delicious, fit to be offered to the king for his enjoyment. When the time comes for the king to take his meal, a discriminating servant can choose those fruits ready to offer him. From the appearance of the fruits, the servant can tell which are ripe in the middle but still raw on the outside, and thus not yet fit for the king. By the application of a special heating process, these remaining fruits will become ripe in 2 or 3 days, and then they too will be ready to offer to the king. Similarly, among the Munichari gopis, as we heard yesterday, are the gopis who were previously sages of Dandakaranya, who saw Ramchandra and desired the perfection of their eternal relationship with Gopal, because Narada Muni had initiated these sages into the 10-syllable Gopal mantra they were chanting. So they were chanting Gopal mantra, and their object of love was Brajendanandan Gopal, not Ramchandra. Similarly, among the Munichari gopis who took birth in Gokul, those who completely gave up the materiality of their bodies and very early in life achieved purely spiritual bodies were able to remain untouched by any other man. Thus, Yogamaya allowed them to join the Nityasiddha and other advanced gopis when they went to meet Krishna. Other Munichari gopis still retain some connection with the external material body, but even they, after being parched by the heat of separation from Krishna, gave up the materiality of their bodies and assumed perfectly transcendental bodies, purified of all taint of contact with other men. On the night of the Rasa Dance, Yogamaya sent some of these gopis out behind those who had already gone out. Others who Yogamaya saw still had a slight amount of contamination, she kept back to further purify with the heat of separation, and then she sent them out on some other night. So there's 3 categories of gopis described here. The Munichari gopis, particularly. Those whose purvarag, or their intense let's say, preliminary attraction to Krishna, with the intense hope of meeting Krishna, had become sufficiently evolved to the point where they had attained Vastu Siddhi early in the game, and they went to Krishna. Then some of them who were detained, the separation caused the materiality of their bodies to burn up, and the spiritual bodies to become fully manifest, and they left in their spiritual bodies that very same night and attained Maharas. And then yet others who were still too much contaminated were detained, and they attained Rasa Lila in the next year. After enjoying the pleasures of the Rasa Dance and other pastimes with Krishna, the Munichari Gopis who had participated went back to their homes when the night was over, as did the Nityasiddha and other advanced Gopis. But now Yogamaya protected these Munichari Gopis from the material association of their husbands. In other words, these Gopis were devoid of any selfish attachment for husband, children, and so on. Since these Gopis were thoroughly immersed in the great ocean of love for Krishna, their breasts dried up, so they could not feed their infants, and to their family members they appeared as if haunted by ghosts. In conclusion, it is not unseemly that the Gopis who were previously in material association joined in the Rasa Dance. Some authorities, however, maintain that the Gopis who were kept back in their houses did not have children. According to them, whenever such words as apatya, children, are used in verses yet to come, these words refer to the children of co-wives, to adopted children, or to nephews and nieces. And that's the end of our purport. And it's only 20 minutes almost, a little after 20 minutes, till 9. So, although I'm you can say, hypocritical wretch and not worthy of making any effort to discuss these subject matters, still, my request is that as Prabhupada sometimes glorified Chanakya Pandit, he said that even the sign of a knowledgeable man is that he is able to accept meaningful advice from a fool. So, if we do extend, past your allotted time for hearing such discourses in Bhagavatam class, then if you have something more important to do, then I won't hold it against you if you humbly bow out. But I don't know where this is going to take us and how long it's going to take to discuss these things. You're welcome to stay, even if it means missing prasadam, or I know the VIHE is going on and whatnot. Sometimes it takes me up to 10 o'clock or even more to discuss the things. One thing I would like to point out is that in this last section of the purport, there was some discussion about how the different levels of the devotees or the gopis, say, progress in the matter of purification of their bhava. That those who are completely pure, the mark of their purity is that they're purely spiritualized or spiritual bodies are unsullied by association with other so-called husbands on the material platform. So the conclusion should be that no woman in her right mind would desire the association of any other man than Krishna. That should be the conclusion. So, anyway, I don't know what's going on with the mic. Is there? Hare Krishna. Maybe there's something wrong with the connection or something. Hare Krishna. So, these statements, and sometimes you will hear me harping on this kind of, let's say, subject matter. But you should not take it or misunderstand my purpose or the purpose of the acharyas in, let's say, driving these points home. Why the acharyas present, let's say, the fallibility of material associations. In reality, it is to wake us up to a higher sense of responsibility to Krishna. And also, it is to humble us. Because if we're not willing to recognize our own lowly condition, then we may not have the, let's say, proper soil in which to grow the bhakti lata. So it's very necessary for us all to take the humble position. It's just like sometimes we see that, I've seen this a lot in our society, that the grihastas, those who, identify themselves with the grihasta ashram, many times they will, let's say, put forward the idea that, who are these brahmacharis and sannyasis? Us grihastas are as good as the brahmacharis and sannyasis. Actually, even we're better, because Manu Samhita says that the grihasta ashram is the best of all ashrams, because the grihasta ashram provides for all the other ashrams, so therefore it's the best of ashrams. So, and the sannyasis might think that, these grihasta sense gratifiers, who are they, to say anything? We're the best, we're the spiritual masters of the, varnas and ashrams, etc. So of course this is all based on mundane considerations. The real mentality should be that I'm so lowly and fallen. The grihasta should be thinking that I'm so lowly and fallen that I could not, have the, let's say, wherewithal to, let's say, manifest in my heart the necessary standard of renunciation, as do these exalted sannyasis and brahmacharis, etc., giving them the benefit of the doubt. And similarly, the sannyasis should also think that I'm so fallen and wretched, in comparison to these exalted grihastas. If I were to be associated with the objects of the senses as the grihastas are in their grihasta ashram, in their grihasta life, surely I would go to hell. Surely I would fall down. The grihastas, giving them the benefit of the doubt, the grihastas must be highly exalted devotees who are beyond. They're actually stitadi munis, or you can say they're really dhira in the true sense, that they can remain aloof, in spite of the provocation, etc. So in either case, it's necessary to cultivate humility. So similarly, when in the Shastras or in the Acharya Vani, we will see such instructions that women are 9 times lustier and 10 times more egocentric and all these things. This is a lookout, which is to help, because impartially the acharyas are giving instructions for the benefit of all classes. Striyo, Vaishyas, Tata, Shudras, all of them can achieve the Param Gatim, or the supreme destination. But because we're coming from different levels of material conditioning and have to get out of the material conditioning, there's necessity to assess our condition, and by doing so, take recourse to the path of abject humility so that we can hope to make progress. We're simply needed to take the path of pure devotional service. We're simply required, to take the path of pure devotional service, which necessitates the seedbed of pure devotional humility, which goes beyond material considerations ultimately, anyway. So, anyway, it's hard for me to gather my thoughts, but I want to make some, discussion possible in the matter of our prime necessity of life, and the purpose of the Bhagavatam, the purpose of the Bhagavat class. It is mentioned by Srila Prabhupada in the Krishna book. He says that the example of the Gopis is very instructive to persons who are trying to be absorbed in Krishna consciousness. This is from the chapter of the Gopis' feeling of separation. The example of the Gopis is very instructive to persons who are trying to be absorbed in Krishna consciousness. So we should ask that, are we trying to be absorbed in Krishna consciousness or not? So is there anyone here who is not trying to be absorbed in Krishna consciousness? So then we should, if we can ascertain that in fact we're here because we're trying to be absorbed in Krishna consciousness, then we should understand that this instruction is for us. Srila Prabhupada's instruction is meant for us. The example of the Gopis is very instructive to persons who are trying to be absorbed in Krishna consciousness. One can very easily associate with Krishna simply by remembering his transcendental pastimes. everyone has a tendency to love someone, that Krishna should be the object of love is the central point of Krishna consciousness. By constantly chanting the Hare Krishna mantra and remembering the transcendental pastimes of Krishna, one can be fully in Krishna consciousness and thus make his life sublime and fruitful. So really the purpose in all these discussions is to make us act on the information. We are not simply to let's say, stand by as, you can say, spectators. This is not a spectator sport. But we're meant to also, let's say, cherish. We're meant to also come to the position of cherishing the hope of attaining an eternal relationship with Krishna. So, it is not that we should simply think that our hearing is for the sake of hearing, because Guruji says that we should attend the Bhagavatam class, so we have to hear, as if we're forced by Guru's instruction. Even on the platform of Vaidhi Bhakti, this hearing is meant to, because it's not ordinary Vaidhi Bhakti. Prabhupada didn't give us Vaidhi Bhakti. He gave us Vaidhi directed toward Rag, because he's given us subject matters of discussion which are meant to elevate us to the point of attraction. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, attraction to Krishna, attraction to Brajendra Nandan, and ultimately attraction to the lotus feet of Srimati Radharani. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, in his Samodhana Bhasya of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's Shikshamrita, he tells that for the sadhaka, because he actually has no experience of association with Krishna, it is only appropriate to cultivate the Purvarag aspect of Vipralamba Bhav. Vipralamba Bhav is having various aspects: Purvarag, Man, Prema Vaititya, and Pravas. So Purvarag, or the preliminary attraction, with the hope, the anticipation of meeting Krishna in the future, that is the main consideration of Purvarag for the sadhaka. And that is only appropriate for the sadhaka, because the sadhaka can hear about Krishna. An example given is the example of Rukmini Devi. And even there's an example of Radharani as well, when she heard about Krishna and she heard Krishna's name, she heard Krishna's flute, she saw Krishna's picture, so she became attracted to, whom she thought was three different personalities, thus condemning herself. This was a matter of her Purvarag. Rukmini, also upon hearing about the glorious activities of Krishna from the mouth of Narada, she also manifested an exemplary standard of Purvarag. So, this hearing about Krishna is the prime means by which we can cultivate this purvarag, preliminary attraction. There's no question of cultivating this feeling of separation without hearing the subject matters of Krishna's transcendental Brajalilas.